Welcome to Interviews from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlson, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best, here on Telesur. In recent years, Mexico itself has seemed like something straight out of a crime novel. And some of the wildest stories are, of course, true. It's attracted writers from the genre from all over the world. Today we'll be talking to one of them. Patrick Bard is a journalist, photographer, and crime novelist from France. Patrick, thank you so much for being with us here today on Interviews from Mexico.
Thank you.
Patrick, you have a very interesting history. You grew up in a working-class city in France, and you ended up in 1996 on the US-Mexico border. Tell us, how did you make the decision to go work on the border?
I was working as a photojournalist, well, so do I today. And I had some friends campaigning in California for a fair trade campaign. And, well, they told me right after the NAFTA began, well, you should go to Mexico, on the Mexican side of the border, and see what's happening, because you have dozens of plants settling every week all along the border. So you might be interested in documenting what's happening there. So that's when I decided to come and see what was happening. Plus, one thing, a few years before, I was in Berlin when the wall was falling, and then another wall was being built all along the border between the US and Mexico. So I wanted to see that again, because really I couldn't really figure out, I couldn't really believe another wall was built. You know?
Yeah, at the same time when the United States, of course, was one of the countries that most celebrated the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then we have this phenomenon.
For me, it was a huge paradox, really.
Yeah, a real contradiction. It was a time when there were a lot of changes taking place right after NAFTA. In some ways, we've seen it come full circle now with the renegotiation. So when you got there, what did you find? What most impressed you?
What most impressed me, first I saw, of course, the fence. The fence that was still a work in progress.
Yeah, and people forget now that Trump talks so much about building a wall on the border, they forget that this started a long time ago.
Yeah, the Clinton administration decided to begin the construction of that wall. I'm trying to remember the name of the operation. Gatekeeper, I think it was Gatekeeper operation. So it was a long time ago. And then I crossed the border. I came through California. And then I crossed the border, and the first thing I can remember was these very new, modern plants, and all these neighborhoods with paper and carton shelters, and all these workers, mostly women, living in these neighborhoods all along the desert with no water, no electricity, no nothing, and they lived in these shelters made with the cardboard of the maquiladoras of the
big boxes.
Yeah, the big boxes. So you could tell where every one of them was working, because you have the brands on the paperboard, so on the cardboards of the houses. So that's the first thing I remember.
And it was this huge contrast between this new discourse of prosperity with NAFTA and all these jobs being created and people are going to be so better off, and it turns out they're working for survival wages to the extent that they have to use the cardboard boxes from the parts that they're assembling to build their houses. I remember that time, and that's exactly what impressed me too.
Yes, because the wages were so low. I mean, if I remember well, it was like $5 a day.
It still is.
And it still is. And on the other side of the border, on the U.S. side of the border, it was a little more than $5 an hour, which was incredibly different if you consider that the cost of living on the Mexican side of the border was only 30% less than it was on the U.S. side. Then you realize why they had to live in these cardboard, paperboard shelters on the desert, because they had no money to, they couldn't afford to rent a house or an apartment or something, because their wages was too low.
And you ended up staying there in the border region and writing 2 books for quite some time, for a number of years, didn't you?
Yeah. Well, I began in '96 and I ended in 2001. So yes, for quite a long time. It's a huge border. It's a huge area.
Were you going back and forth to different
places? Yes, I did.
And
well, to me, it's not even a border. It's I would define it as a third country. It's
oh, really? A whole different culture? A whole
yes, and it's a place where both countries are separated with that fence, but in the same time mixed up together. It's kind of strange. And it's also a place with a lot of violence. And I would begin with the conditions of work of these women workers in the maquiladoras, because the first thing I remember about these conditions is, for instance, the obligation they had in some of these maquiladoras monthly to show their used sanitary towels, just to prove they were not pregnant. Because the direction didn't want to hire pregnant women, and it was a humiliation.
To avoid having to pay anything like that.
Yeah, and it was so humiliating. And I mean, they were denied as women and as human beings. I mean, the sexual harassment was something very common in the maquiladoras also. And also another thing I remember pretty well was the accidental abortions because of the solvents that were used.
The miscarriages.
Yeah. The solvent that were used in the maquiladoras. And there were many accidental abortions, or babies born with deformations, disease like spina bifida. Spina bifida, for instance, was something very common. So if you put all this together with the risk of sexual violation in the colonias, in these poor neighborhoods, because of the promiscuity with men and no protection, the fact that these women, they were coming out of their turn sometimes at 3 at night, in the middle of the night, with no transportation to go back home. So they had to walk until the desert from the plant to go back home, and just put it together, all this, and the urban violence brought by the cartels, for instance, and you have a climate that I would define as evil ecosystem.
An evil ecosystem.
Yeah.
That's a powerful phrase for it. And unfortunately, that violence, you know, of course, we continue to see it. It's not part of the past, even though we're talking here about over a decade ago. And in the borders area in Ciudad Juarez. And one of the big factors is that no one was ever held, or no one is hardly ever held accountable for it, for the birth defects, for the working conditions, for the crimes committed against women. One of the issues that really began to be internationally known at that time was the femicides, particularly related to Ciudad Juarez, but not restricted to Ciudad Juarez. Did you work on that issue as a journalist while you were there as well?
I did. In fact, I arrived in Juarez for the first time in '96, so the femicides had just begun, and it was...
Or at least just begun to be noticed as such.
Yes. I remember I met someone called Esther Chavez. She was a feminist and very involved in the defense of women, and she's one of the persons that alerted me on the femicides in Juarez. So I began to document the cases and the families, the victims, and everything. And then I realized that in the middle of everything was the fact that no one was ever punished for these crimes. No man was ever punished for these crimes. And it was even easier for the justice to design a victim as a prostitute, for instance. I remember a body found in the desert, and they said, "Oh, okay, she was she had lipstick, so probably she was a prostitute." So it was easier not to investigate and just say that, and no one was punished. And the fact that no one was punished is for me one of the deep roots of the wave and the increasing of the wave of the femicide, because a man could use a woman, could rape her, could harm her, could kill her, and there were no consequences for him. So that's when it began to grow up and take proportions. And at the beginning, probably the climate of the urban violence had some connections to these crimes. I mean, you can imagine some men drunk, maybe they had taken some drugs also, and they came out from a bar or some nightclub or some place, I don't know, and they met some worker at 4 in the morning, in the middle of the night, walking towards her poor neighborhood, and they took her and they raped her and they killed her and they abandoned the body in the desert. And what happened? Well, nothing happened. And 1, and then 10, and then 100, and then 200, and then 300. And that's, well, to me, the guilt is this evil ecosystem. Really, that's the origin, and that's the explanation of it. And I mean, the killing women, raping women became an occupation.
So we had an evil ecosystem of impunity, a complete lack of justice, male violence gone wild, and a vulnerability of women caused in part by the economic model, because we do know that many of those were women who worked in the factories, who didn't have safe ways to get around.
They were very exposed,
yeah.
And it was, well, fresh flesh for men. And, well, if you consider for instance, the narco culture. The narco culture is a very machist culture also, and the northern culture of Mexico is very a very cowboy culture. In many ways, it's also very machist, and when men, because also as all these women, they had work, they had a job. Men didn't have a job. So when men are afraid of losing power, and they became more violent.
Yeah, there's that backlash part of it too. That's the situation that you found in terms, specifically we've been talking here about femicides, and I know that from there you actually investigated as a journalist the phenomenon of the disappearance and the murder of women in other parts of the world as well. How did that compare?
Well, in many ways, you can compare and find common points. For instance, several years later, in 2008, we spent with my wife, we were working together, we spent a month in Guatemala to investigate about femicide. The routes are pretty different because they had this internal conflict, civil war that lasted until 96, and the Guatemalan army killed 200,000 civilians, mostly Mayans, so mostly indigenous people. Genocide. And part of that genocide were campaigns of rapes in the villages to destroy the cohesion of the communities. And it was not only because the soldiers were raping women after slaughtering men, it was something absolutely planned by the army. And when the conflict ended, the soldiers integrated either the police or private security forces or organized crime. So that's, if you add that with the phenomenon of the maras also, then you create another evil ecosystem. Well, a little bit different, but not that different. I mean, you also find the maquilas in Guatemala. You also find the fragile lives of all these young and poor women exposed. And
you also find major deficiencies in the justice system.
And also an impunity climate. So. Yeah, you have all the same ingredients. And recently, I'm talking about last April, I went to Canada, and we're talking about the prime first world. And
indigenous women.
Yes,
we hear very little about this here.
Yeah.
In fact, in general, the media has not really talked a lot about it.
Yes.
But the numbers are astounding.
The numbers are astounding. I had to portraitize, to make pictures of a native woman, and because she is the first graduated attorney of our nation. She's Algonquina. She's from the Algonquin Nation, and she's working with the National Crime Investigation Commission on indigenous women assassinated, because in Canada, when you're an indigenous woman, your risk to be killed are 8 times more elevated than being white.
Oh my God.
So it was really
That's
impressive.
beginning to look like a genocide too.
Yes, and you find the same ingredients. I mean, inside the communities, there's a lot of domestic violence, because, well, probably around 150,000 people were incorporated, forced in Catholic and religious pensionate institution during the 60s, 70s,
and taken from their families.
And it destroyed the cohesion of the communities. There's a lot of drug and alcohol, and there's a lot of domestic violence. But also, these women, they live in remote areas in the reservation. So when they have to go out, to go to schools, to go to the cities, they have to hitchhike a lot in areas where there are a lot of people, a lot of men working in the mining industry or in the log industry. And it's also a very machist culture. And they are also very exposed, because they have to move, they don't have cars, they don't have, and they just hitchhikes, and some of them are just 15 or 16 years old, so they are very exposed inside their communities and outside their community.
And as a journalist, do you feel a specific responsibility to tell these stories? Why are you attracted to these stories?
I do, especially because even in the media world, sometimes people that just don't understand. I'm going to tell you a story that happened to me very recently, probably like a month ago. A French newspaper asked me some pictures of this native attorney. They wanted to write an article, so I sent some pictures, and they called me back and told me, well, we received the pictures. They're okay, but well, maybe would you have some pictures of her with I don't know. They didn't know how to tell me, really. But with a costume or something. But like she's a lawyer. So I sent you some pictures with.
That's the way she dresses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, they wanted an Indian costume, and do you know why? Because she's blonde. She has blonde hair.
Oh.
And well, you don't notice that much that she's native. And I told them, well, the fact that she is blonde tells everything about her being a woman and a native woman. Do you know why? Because she's blonde. Because her mother was raped when she was 16 by a Swedish tourist. So that's why she's blonde. So it tells way more than plumes or whatever costume you can think of about her being a native woman.
Oh, that story made my skin crawl, and it breaks so many stereotypes. I thought you were going to say because they had that folkloric vision of native women, but that's much more powerful. You did this work as a journalist, and as a result, the book El Norte was published about the border area with many of those stories where you go down and you talk to the women and the people who are directly involved. Mm-hmm. But out of that experience, you also published a crime novel, La Frontera. How did you decide to make that leap from a journalist to a fictionalized account of what you were seeing there?
Well, in fact, Mexico made me a writer. You're also a journalist, so you know that journalism is about facts. Mm-hmm. And it brings to a democratic debate in a democracy. But also we're talking about people made of blood and flesh. And many times, facts are not enough to tell them as people made of blood and flesh. And I had written some short stories before that had been published, and that's when I decided to write a novel, because all these women that I saw, that I met in Juarez, they were so admirable. They didn't want to be seen as victims. Mm-hmm. They did want to be seen as subjects, as persons who didn't accept injustice, impunity, and they were so admirable. So I wanted really hard to give them life more than with journalism or photojournalism. And novel is made of paper and ink, but sometimes all these characters made of ink and paper, they're more real or as real as people made of flesh and blood.
Well, you have your own space then. You can create your own space. And I haven't written fiction, but I can see the attraction as you're describing it. You can create your own space in which to build a strong character.
Absolutely.
Because if they give us 1,000 words, even if you get a strong quote in there, in a paragraph about how amazing this person is, it's just not enough.
It's not enough. And I really wanted to tell a story, and fiction is very powerful about that. Yeah. I mean, in the middle of a fiction, you have empathy. And to identify himself, the reader, has to be very empathetic, and also the writer has to be very empathetic to make his character live. So empathy is in the middle of everything in a novel, so that's why I like it so much.
and the novel ended up winning prizes.
Yes.
And so clearly it affected many people in that way. Well, unfortunately, we've come to the end of the show very quickly. And as a last question, I wanted to ask you, you've mentioned that Mexico is very important to you. You know, what's the fascination that you developed with our country?
Well, as I told you, Mexico made me a writer, so Mexico made me a part of who I am. And I'm very grateful, and I feel now it's like my second country.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I hope we get a chance to talk again.
Thank you.
And thank you. We'll be back next week on Interviews from Mexico.